Hi, everyone. My name is Mo Alefi. I am Executive Director of the Institute of Politics and Public Service at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy, and welcome to the October installment of the Battleground and Civility polls. The Institute of Politics and Public Service has been the proud home of the Battleground poll since the spring of 2019. For those of you that are unfamiliar with it, it has just celebrated its 30th anniversary. Project born by legendary Democratic pollster Celinda Lake and legendary Republican pollster Ed Goaz. For 30 years, the Battleground poll has been gauging and tracking voter attitudes on a whole host of issues. When moving over here, in the spring of 2019, we added a component that is tracking voters' attitudes on civility and polarization in politics. And so we're excited to share with you all today the latest data from this poll. The data shouldn't surprise many people, but I think it's gonna, the way Ed and Celinda will explain it, might shed some new light on some of it. People are upset. People are frustrated, and as a result, we're seeing the approval ratings for the president drop. We're seeing approval ratings for both parties in Congress drop. Voters are frustrated at what they see as a lack of result, and they're actually fairly pessimistic on issues like where the economy will be in the future. They're pessimistic about polarization and whether it will get better or worse a year from now. And so Ed and Celinda, one of the things I love about this poll is they both conduct the poll, they and their teams conduct the poll, and then they retreat to their separate corners to write independent analyses. So today we're gonna get to see what their independent analyses show. So with that, I will toss it over to Celinda to present the Democratic analysis, and then she will toss it over to Ed for the Republican. Celinda, take it away.
Thank you so much. And it's really a privilege to be here. And Mo, as always, we love the intellectual framing that you set and the partnership with you. And of course, I don't have enough good words to say about the strategic analysis of Ed and his friendship and collegiality as well. So this is a very, very positive continuation of an effort in what are very tough times. As you said, Mo, people's attitudes are dominated by frustration, polarization, and anxiety. And independents in particular are mad at everybody and everything. There are a few highlights in the data for the Democrats, but frankly, for both parties and anybody in elected office right now, there's a really strong warning that voters are very, very upset with how things are going. For the Democrats, there is the one good point in this data is some bounce back on COVID. When Delta first hit, voters were very, very discouraged by COVID. And they thought that COVID was going to be over and we had done our thing and now we were all going to be on the right track, and were we prepared enough? And the president now has resumed getting positive job performance marks for his efforts on COVID. And the two ideas that we tested, which included private and public vaccine mandates, both of them have a bare majority support. And if you take out the strong anti-vaxxers, then you're over to 2/3 of the voters who support both of those ideas. People are absolutely disgusted with Congress as an institution, and they're not too happy with either party. And as I often say, and I think Ed quoted me in his analysis, the only good thing about being a Democrat right now is that you get to run against Republicans, because people are upset at the Democrats in Congress by 2-1, and Democrats have declined in their feelings toward Congress, but people are also even more upset at Republicans. And Ed's analysis does a brilliant job, I think, of identifying that both parties need to get things done, and that both parties need to look to the bulk of the public who really wants things done. One of the things that's most disturbing in this data, and this is a contribution that the McCourt School really added to the analysis and was the brainchild of Mo, was the massive depression about incivility in the country. Among independents right now, division is the number one problem in the country. A quarter of Americans say they can no longer talk to certain family members, and 35% of 18 to 34-year-olds say they can't talk to certain family members. Now, I grew up as in the Vietnam, and their parents.
So Linda, I
There
think,
is a very, very discouraging sense in the public of polarization that affects.
so Linda, can you hear us?
Is there a problem with?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you cut out for a moment, but we got you back. So if you want to maybe repeat the last point you were making.
So 35% of young people say that they have family members that they can no longer talk to. Now, as Ed and I are both children of the Vietnam generation, not being able to talk to your parents is kind of a norm, but it does speak to the incivility of the times. And in one of the most interesting and I think devastating questions from the get-go was the question of, are we on the verge of civil war? And we had astoundingly high numbers for that in the original Battleground when we first asked it, and that data has continued. Finally, 63% of Americans say they expect the next generation to be worse off. That's an astounding number. Our families, most of our families, not all, some came on slave ships, but most of our families came over here because their kids were going to do better. My parents moved from New York City to Montana because their kids were going to be better off. This is a real violation of what is the core of this country. People uniting to get things done, and people being uniting and aspiring to have their kids do better off. So there is a very, very profound crossroads that we are at. So let's talk a little bit more about the data. First of all, Americans are worried about lots of things right now. They have the capacity to be worried about a lot of issues: healthcare, COVID, the economy, many aspects of the economy, cost of living, jobs. But economic anxiety is quite dominant, and it's both short-term and long-term. And one of the things that's really stunning about the economic anxiety is how dramatic it is for Gen Z, millennials, and Gen Xers, in really stark contrast to the baby boomers. The baby boomers believe that they can survive things, and they've gotten themselves into pretty good shape. The Gen Xers wonder if they're ever going to achieve stability, and the millennials and Gen Zers really wondering what kind of future they have. Another thing that's very, very important as we face all of the existential crises is how much climate change is now a top tier concern for every age cohort. It used to be only young people were really concerned about climate change. Now 22% of seniors rate it as their first or second most important issue, tied with COVID. Very, very important change for the long run. We looked at several issues, including student loans and COVID vaccine, and those numbers are in here. I think the most important thing, though, is to look as we head into this Build Back Better and the confrontation and compromise that will follow. Where do we stand on the issues? President Biden's job performance continuing to be in the 40s. And there has been some erosion among Democrats, although it is not liberal Democrats who have eroded. Liberal Democrats are over 80% approving of the president's job performance in general and approving of the president's job performance on the economy. It is more centrist, moderate, conservative Democrats who are more concerned about whether the president can get the job done, with 2/3 approving on the economy and 73% approving of his job in general. The more specific you get, the more unhappy voters are. And the job performance on inflation, cost of living, immigration, Afghanistan. These are all where we have almost half of the voters strongly disapproving and only a third of the voters improving. As the president has said repeatedly, Congress and the president must get something done. And voters overwhelmingly believe that compromise to get something done is as important or even more important than standing up if things don't get done. Right now, people are not for compromise ideologically, they're for compromise and coming together to get things done. And that's what we saw in the campaign as well. When President Biden was speaking during the campaign, he would often say that he was for unity in America and bringing ourselves together. And people said, yes, so we can get things done. Finally, people give the president credit for trying to bring the country together and trying to get things done. And I think the burden right now for everyone in an elected office is to demonstrate that you can get something accomplished. So on that note, let me turn it over to Ed to give the other side of the story.
And I'm going to try to skip over a couple of the numbers that are just a matter of saying what the numbers are. One of the interesting things about reading Celinda's analysis and kind of comparing it back to mine is that this is the first Battleground survey we have done this on in almost 6 years that neither one of us mentioned the ex-president in the survey. And I think that is appropriate. I think while there's a lot of discussion out there amongst the media of who's doing what to who and who's saying what, the bottom line in politics is that the real gravity that kind of pulls everyone back to earth comes from the incumbent president, not from ex-presidents. And so it's not surprising to see some of these numbers, especially some of the numbers that are pulling Biden down to a upside down on his job approval and very negative on many of the issue handling. I also think we're in an environment, and I've said this to Celinda for years, and I have to be a little bit careful because it's many of those issues are ones she cares about. But I see evidence in the activities of the progressives and how they are handling things, that they are, and I've said this to Celinda, quite frankly, for a couple of years now, they're kind of the Tea Party of the Democratic Party. The way they are operating, the way they are kind of sticking in on certain things and not caving. I think there's going to be some political problems coming from that. And I think we're seeing some evidence of it now, of the president kind of having to maneuver to get approval, when in fact he could get much of that approval by just going more to the center. And not worrying about the progressives quite so much, and certainly not worrying about the Tea Partiers. But I'll get into that a little bit later in the survey. I think the traditional thing I can say about the Battleground poll that we're looking at these numbers is that normally a president has a honeymoon period. And the question whether that solidifies or whether it begins to deteriorate is always a key question for the first year of any president. And I think what we are clearly seeing in this data is the traditional honeymoon for the president, and the honeymoon with voter expectations certainly is over. They're now looking for things to happen, promises to be met. And that comes from all levels of the electorate. He now finds himself trying to pass major parts of his initial legislative agenda in a political environment that is increasingly negative, and an image with voters that has turned equally negative. Voters give low job approvals rankings for the president overall, and on a range of key issues, while also giving low job approval ratings to both Republicans and Democrats. He gets very low ratings on many of the key issues that voters are looking at. In addition, all of the policy issues we examine in this poll, vaccine mandates, election reforms, student loan debt, voters are really split with notable levels of passion on both sides, but very equal in terms of their responses on those issues. And they're remarkably pessimistic about the future of their economic status. On a longer timeline, voters express a preference for solution-seeking politicians over ideologues. However, voters continue to think political divide in this country is concerning, and they expect this divide to get worse. On an optimistic note, we created a new voter segmentation in this analysis on the Republican side, looking at the data. We, for years, have been asking, not are you conservative, moderate, or liberal? We ask, are you conservative or liberal? And in 30 years of asking that question in Battleground surveys, we've never had more than 10% of the electorate identify themselves as moderate. We then ask, are you very conservative or very liberal? And that kind of identifies, I've always felt, that identifies the ideologues on both ends of the spectrum, people that the ideology is often more important than getting solutions and getting results. And that's where you see some of the debate coming up now with the moderates in terms of the president's legislation, just as you saw for many years, the Tea Party interjecting strongly their opinions on what was there. What was interesting when we broke it and put the very conservative, very liberal on both ends, and then took the conservative, somewhat liberal, and volunteered moderate, and combined them as a centrist to look at how strong that center of the electorate was, it ended up being 65% of the electorate. We also see in many of the questions that we asked that they really are looking for compromise over ideology. They're looking for solutions, certainly, but they're not looking for the ideology to drive the yes or no of getting those solutions. And I think that's going to be very important as we kind of work going forward. The right direction, wrong track on the political environment is very negative. As we saw when President Trump came into office and wrong track went down into the 50s for the first time in almost a decade and a half. We saw Biden starting off with wrong track in the 50s, but it's now back over 60% at that 63%, almost 2/3 of Americans saying it's on the wrong track. On the issues, and that's where, put my glasses on here, things really, really did jump in terms of there are several issues that ended up being about 20% of the electorate mentioned them as either the first or the second most important issue. Those issues were climate change at 20%, division in the country at 21%, rising cost of living at 19%, jobs in the economy at 20%, and government spending at 19%. Now, I know that there is a lot of concern, and Celinda mentioned concern about the economy, but some of these concerns, government spending, jobs in the economy, rising cost of living, are all, quite frankly, being driven by kind of questioning as Congress moves forward, is this going to make these things better or is it going to make it worse? And while there is some partisan split on this, hold on one second, some partisan split on this, the things that really kind of jump out to me was number one, significant numbers of Republicans selected immigration at 16%, government spending at 15%, and cost of living at 14%. 1 in 4 Democrats, their number one issue was climate change. And among independents, division in the country was at 14%, cost of living was at 11%, and government spending 11%. That last group, focusing more on cost of living and government spending, along with division in the country, they're the ones that are watching very closely and will be key to the future of either party in terms of, do they cave and go towards the Republicans, or are they satisfied with what they're saying and cave towards the Democrats? And that's something to watch in the coming months. On the president's job approval, I'll just mention very quickly, there were 4 issues that not only were getting towards that 60% disapproval rating, which is usually a very damaging level to get at on a job approval type of question. But there were 4 issues that were right at 50% strongly disapprove, which means that those voters are really digging in. And that was on immigration, dealing with Afghanistan, inflation, cost of living. The interesting thing that I would note that I didn't put in my analysis is that there was always a theory that President Biden was going to give the Democrats, give the progressives a quick victory. And he did that with all the Democrats voting for his initial piece of legislation that passed very early on the onset. I always thought he would then pivot to a certain extent and look for a infrastructure bill that would in fact be more of a compromise. And that's what we saw in the Senate, with the infrastructure bill having 19 Republicans voting along with Democrats to pass that bill. The problem with that, which would have shown some real kind of reaching out to the center, really kind of coming together for solutions that was bipartisan, is that right after that bill passed, within days, Afghanistan fell. Immigration was becoming a key issue at the border with some problems down there. And voters were increasingly seeing the price increases, that cost of living and inflation was a major concern. Sometimes it's luck of getting things done at the right time. Sometimes getting things done, but having other things step all over the story becomes an issue. So let me just kind of sum up by saying, I think the center holds the key. That's where the compromise is going to come from. It's going to be things like the infrastructure bill, where you got some Democrats and some Republicans voting for it. And that's what you're going to need kind of going into the future. So while things look bleak today, with frustrated voters, struggling economy, foreign policy setbacks, I believe there's actually better days in the future. I believe most voters are not ideologues who want to fight to the bitter end, but rather are pragmatists who want solutions that will improve their lives. Political leaders would do well to work to pass these types of life-improving policy solutions. While things look bleak today with frustrated voters, a struggling economy, foreign affairs setbacks, there is a path to brighter days. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Ed. The fact that this poll came out of the field and this briefing is taking place within hours of the president announcing a framework for his Build Back Better agenda. I think it's just a fascinating backdrop to look at these numbers. And what happens in the coming hours and coming days will tell us a lot about whether or not our political leaders are seeing this, what I think is a very clear blueprint that voters are giving them about how they want them to move forward. And so either they'll follow that blueprint or they won't. And I guess our next Battleground poll will give us some data on whether or not voters see them as following that blueprint or not. So as always, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Celinda. Anyone tuning in, you can see the full results. One of the things I'm very proud of is that our institute is fully transparent. So not only can you see the questionnaire and the top lines, but you can dive into the crosstabs. You can get the full data set if you really want to geek out on the numbers. Everything is up on our website at politics.georgetown.edu. And please feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to talk with either Ed or Celinda about to go a little bit deeper. So thanks so much. Take care.